Welcome. My name is Bob Tickleman. I'm a Principal Microsoft Technical Trainer. I'm excited to be your guide for this Module 3, Implement Shared Access Signatures, part of the Authentication and Authorization Learning Path as part of the AZ-204 course. We're going to take a look at the different types of SaaS tokens that are available to us, and we're going to see how you can use these shared access signatures to gain access to resources. And we're going to show you a way to do a bulk edit or access to these using a thing called an access policy. A shared access signature is just one of the ways in which we can control access to a resource. Now, I would probably say the best way would be you use RBAC, or the role-based access control, which allows you to then use these identities that we've been talking about in other recordings to individually gain access to a resource. The problem with the SaaS token, you'll see this as we get into it, is if it has to be shared somehow, and we're going to talk about just taking that and maybe sending it to somebody, it now potentially creates a security risk. But it is one great way to be able to gain access to a number of resources. So we'll take a look at the SaaS token, the characteristics that make up a SaaS token, and how to use the SaaS token itself. I'm going to come back to this slide after we go through, but I'm going to show you a user delegated SaaS versus an account SaaS, and then we'll take a look at service SaaSes and the ways that you can associate them, and then some best practices. So let's go to the interface. So I'm currently in a storage account, which is one of the areas that we most often use a SaaS token. From previous recordings, you saw that we had a series of characteristics around the storage account. And I'm going to come back to the access control IAM, or the RBAC features. Now, these ones are on the actual storage account itself. So we're dealing at the macro level. Remember, storage accounts are regionally based units of storage and replication. And so you would have to do this for every storage account, depending on the access control you want to work with. I'm going to come back and take a look at the role assignments. And if you want to learn more about RBAC and how it's created, the first module in this permission and authentication series would be the one you want to take a look at. We've also seen that the different types of storage that we have containers, file shares, queues, and tables. We've talked about containers throughout this series. We've talked a little bit about queues, and we'll get more into this in other recordings. And we haven't really talked about tables too much, but this provides a lightly structured form. Now, if you remember in the Cosmos DB recordings, we talked a bit about its comparison to tables. This is that feature, part of a storage account. Now I'm going to come down, and we've talked about access keys. Now these are the access keys for the encryption of the storage account itself. Remember that by default, all of the storage accounts are encrypted at rest, and these are going to be the keys that are going to be needed to access that storage account. We've taken a look at the types of encryption, whether they're managed by Microsoft or your own. I'm not going to cover that right now. But I want to now take a look at this shared access signature. This is the topic that we're currently taking a look at. So this is going to give you a SaaS token for the storage account. We've seen that we have blob, file, queues, or tables, so you can select some or all of these. And within inside of these different services, how do I want to gain access to it? The objects in themselves. So there's a container object. When we take a look at the blob storage, do I want access to the objects or the container? Or do I want access to the service? So do I want access to the entire file service? Or if I want access to just, let me just turn this off here, show you an example. I want just blob access to a container, or maybe just an object within a container. And you can see that it's starting to deprecate some of the features along the way. We then take a look at characteristics of a blob, and you'll see this as we take a look at the other ones. What is the start and expiry date of this SaaS token that you're going to create? What is the IP address range? We don't talk too much about it in the course, but you could designate this down to a specific subnet if you wanted to. And it is actually one of the better recommended practices that, especially if you're using an application, say in the mid-tier of your three-tier network, that you don't want to have this information exfiltrated. So you want to be able to just limit it to that subnet that's dealing with it. What protocols do you want to use? We always recommend that you use the HTTPS protocol. And then it's going to generate the token itself. So this is going to be done at the storage account level. I'm now going to come into a container which is where we keep our blobs. And so you can have multiple containers. We talked about this in another recording. And so I can have multiple containers. And at the container level, I can now come in and take a look at a blob or blobs in the container level. I've got a badge.jpg file here. I can now come in and take a look at generating a SAS for the object itself. Now this is going back to the slide, and we'll come back here. Do I want to use a user delegated key or an account key? Our recommendation, you'll see this in the best practices, is wherever possible, you should use a user delegation key, but I'm going to create an account key. I can use a policy. I'm not going to do that now. I'm going to come back to this one in just a few minutes. And then what we want to do is take a look at the permissions that we're going to assign to this SAS that we're going to generate. Now, it is recommended to create and use the least privileged model. So if something only needs read, only give them the necessary permissions that you want. If someone needs read-write, you might want to create a separate key for that. So use the least amount of permissions, and we get a lot of the same characteristics that we had before at the account level. What is the start and the end date? What is the IP address range you want to work with? And what protocols are you going to work with? So I'm going to pick this up, generate that token, and it creates a URL that I can now use. I'm going to bring up a browser here. I'm going to paste in that URL, and you're going to see this as we get back to the course material. There's a format that is followed on the SAS token. It's the HTTPS protocol. It's got RJBT SAS access. That is the storage account name. We've got .blob, the type of storage, .core.windows.net. And that's why the storage account name needs to be globally unique. Then it has the container name. And then what you have is the object name that I'm accessing. Now, I'm not going to go through the rest of this right now because it's better to see it in the detail of the slide when we get back in. But there's all the characteristics then of what was the start date, what was the end date, what was the rev that you're dealing with. So there's a lot of information about the object, and now it gives me access to the object. Now, I want to point out that I'm accessing this over the public internet. So literally, I'm coming from my computer here in the studio where we're recording this. I'm going through the internet and accessing this blob. And this is where you may want to start to lock down some of these from being publicly accessible. And I'll show you other ways to get in and work with this. So taking a look at the information in the course material, we saw that there was a user delegated versus an account SAS that you can create. One would then go to very specific users that you want to work with. I could have taken that SAS token that I used to paste in, and I could have sent it to somebody, maybe as the application developer. I say, here's the account token that you could use to gain access for maybe your application. And we'll talk about different ways to make that available to your application in a secure manner when we take a look at things like Key Vault and storing secrets that might be used with your application. So I hope you're familiar with a lot of those. But you'll see down that right-hand side, a lot of those best practices. Always use the HTTPS protocol. Even if you're going to access it from the local subnet, as opposed to doing what I did, is accessing it over the public internet, you want to make sure that you're using an HTTPS protocol. It says there, you can see that the most secure method is to use user delegation of your SAS. And that's that first bullet point on the left-hand side that we recommend. Wherever possible, you want to have someone have to authenticate to be able to use the SAS that you've generated for them, as opposed to being able to give it out to somebody. That what stops a person from possibly, corrupting that account and then getting access to the SAS token and then using that themselves. So we want to be able to assign it to a user themselves. It's a good idea to always set an expiration time. Also make sure that you're looking at the time range that you're setting it for. I've had cases where you see that it was at UAT time. So you might be setting it that might not either be active or it might end earlier than what you expect to. So make sure that your time is going to work for the use of the application itself. And again, we talked about at the very bottom, make sure that you use the minimum amount of privileges required so that least privilege don't over provision for access to the object. Now, taking a look at the structure of the SAS, and I started pointing that out in the graphical interface when I was showing it to you. You see that the first part of the SAS is going to be the storage account name .blob.core.windows.net. I mentioned this in other recordings that you may want to replace that possibly with the CNAME. So if you had a CNAME reference, you could use that to then direct it to the name that Azure has to have for it, which is that globally unique name that you're working with. Taking a look at the other lines that are coming in, it then identifies what is the permission that you have. Is it read? Is it write? So in fact, there's quite a bit of information that a person who's trying to do some nefarious things could actually determine based on the actual information in the token itself. What was the start time? What was the end time? What was the version of the storage APIs that you're dealing with? And then getting down at the very end of that, the SAS is the actual token or the cryptography keys for the signature that you're dealing with. So that's the structure of it. Now, there's several different ways in which you can use the SAS token. This model is they're going to use a proxy. So you have some user that maybe is uploading a bunch of pictures. You're going to then go to that proxy service that's in the middle. The proxy service would then have access to the SAS to then store that information into the storage account. What this gives you is the capability to then maybe implement some business rules. So it's not the end user directly uploading that information. They're going through that proxy. That proxy has some business processing that you could put on it. Now, it does have the restriction that if you have large numbers of users uploading a large amount of data, you then have to be able to scale that proxy service to the level of service that you want to be able to provide to your end user community. You could do this in a different manner where the user themselves collects the SAS that they need. And we're going to show you methods of how to get that using something maybe like Key Vault, where they're going to get the token and then they use that token directly to then store those objects, in this case, into a storage account. Now, we mentioned when I was doing the demonstration, there's a feature called a stored access policy. They're showing you ways that you can configure the stored access policy at the bottom part of the screen. I'm going to go do this in the graphical interface. There's a couple of things that you can work with. This is an intermediary between the SAS that you created at the storage account level, which access the entire storage account. So whether it be blobs, containers, whether it be file shares, whether it be tables or queues, those could be used for some or all of those storage account capabilities. I'm now going to then be able to associate that with this thing called the storage policy, which are specific to the blobs. They don't apply to the other three types of data that is stored, whether it be file shares, tables, or queues. So let's go ahead and show you a storage policy. And you'll see that there is a restriction that you can only have a maximum of 5 policies per container. So I'm back in the graphical interface. I want to come back out to the container level. And at the container level, I'm going to have the ability to then create an access policy. You can see I've already got one here, read only. That's just a naming convention that I used. I could create a new policy. I'm going to call this read and write. And then you can set the permissions that you need. Now, if I only wanted read and write, which is what I said, I've also given it 2 other ones, add and create. Make sure you understand what each permission is going to give, because what I've just done is I've over-provisioned it. I said I only wanted read and write, but I've given you the ability to create new objects and potentially add objects, which is over-provisioning, just being able to read the existing objects and maybe write back to the existing objects. So make sure you understand the distinction here, because I have just over-provisioned and went against what I was saying you might want to do. You want to set a start and end time. And so now I've got 2 policies. Now I'm just going to create 3 more just so you can see me hit the maximum limit. I'm just going to call this number 3. I'll make it read only, write, and delete. I'm going to create a 4th one. I'll make this for delete and list. And then I'll create my final one, 5. I'm going to give it everything. So I've now been able to create up to 5 policies. If I try and create one more, you'll see that it doesn't give me that capability. But now when I go into the blobs, save this. I'm going to upload a new image. So I've got files that are in here, and you can see I can now generate tokens. I can switch it over to user versus account. And now I can look at the stored access policies, and I now have access to the 5 policies that it would now control the type of access. I don't have to do it. And the benefit about this is I can now control this at the storage account level, that if I give you access to the storage container through the storage account SaaS, and you have a policy that's going to do it, if I delete that policy, I can revoke access to the storage account SaaS token that you're dealing with. Or what I could do is possibly come in and change the end date of the SaaS token, basically expiring it. So it gives you a level of control instead of having to maybe have access to thousands of blobs that are in a storage account container. I want to be able to control that through the storage account policy, as opposed to doing it on a per storage object level and having to create a SaaS token for each one and then manage each one. I can now do it based around having a policy that is then going to control the token that is going to be associated with this. We've seen the different SaaS tokens that we can create. We've seen that you can have an account SaaS, you can have a per user SaaS that you're dealing with. You can have a SaaS token that is going to be assigned to the container itself versus one that's on the storage account. And we now see that we have a filtering process using account access policies to be able to now control access to a number of objects. Let's close out this module with our knowledge check. Question number 1, what type of shared access signature or SaaS applies to blob storage only? Go ahead and pause the recording. That would be a user delegated SaaS token that is only available at the blob objects. Question number 2, what is the most flexible and secure way to use a service shared access signature? Go ahead and pause the recording. That was the final lesson that we covered here, assigning the SaaS to a storage policy. That way you don't have to control them on an individual basis. Looking at access ways to control access to storage information, we've seen that SaaS is one great way to be able to provide this capability. It gives you control of where it's being used from, because you can allocate it to a specific subnet. How long is it going to be available to? I can assign it to a group of users. I can assign it to an account if I'm working with. I can assign it at the storage account level or at the blob level, or as I showed you at the very end, using stored policies that then control it, but you have that limit of maximum of 5 policies. And like any permission sets that you're working with, make sure that you do not over provision access to the SaaS. Give it that least amount of permission. And if you need someone that has something that they need something special, create a SaaS for that one specifically. Maybe have a time restriction on it so that if they need it on an ongoing basis, they may have to request that so that it doesn't expose you to having these highly provisioned tokens that might potentially become compromised. Thank you for joining me on this recording. I look forward to seeing you at a future recording.